Hello everyone and welcome back to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. If you're joining us for the first time, great welcome to you too. You've picked a really good time to join us. Very special guest today, somebody who has been a CIA analyst for 10 years and has studied an awful lot about how different cultures, totalitarian cultures, use information and use different methods to coerce and convince their people to relinquish power to the government. Very interesting conversation. It's a privilege to welcome Stella Morabito. Stella, please say hi.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for having me, Tony. I appreciate it. It's a great opportunity to talk to folks over the pond.
Now, Stella, you have, of course, been a CIA analyst. You're an author. You've written many articles. And in fact, I discovered you after a recent article you wrote in The Federalist about marriage. I wonder if you could just take a moment and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, first of all, I would say that I've always had a special interest, even since childhood, about psychological manipulations and especially things like demonization campaigns, which I didn't understand back then. But as I entered college. I ended up after I graduated with my degree in journalism. I decided to get a master's degree in Russian and Soviet history, and that just really opened my eyes to how destructive one-sided propaganda is, and really destructive. And then later, as you said, I served as an analyst at the CIA, where I focused on Soviet and, mostly communist propaganda and media analysis on things like disinformation. Of course, this was some years ago before our institutions have become totally subverted. But and then I stayed home, raised my children, and then as they got a little older, I started writing. I was always following these cultural issues, especially marriage, and all of the life issues, abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, all that stuff, as well as all the woke creep in our institutions, this so-called progressive ideology, taking over in, all institutions, whether it's the courts and legislatures, education, especially, and medicine now, everything. And so I started writing for the Federalist in 2014. I had already had written for the Washington Examiner. And I focus a lot on most of my writing on these issues, these more issues of groupthink, propaganda, political correctness, but where it's taking us. And so the article that caught your attention on what was called in Congress here the so-called Respect for Marriage Act, which would have codified that Supreme Court ruling about same-sex marriage. It was fascinating to watch the politics of that. Very destructive. But anyway, if you have more specific questions, but finally, in terms of telling you about myself, I just want to mention to your readers that I just published this book called The Weaponization of Loneliness: How Tyrants Stoke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide, and Conquer. And it's really an attempt to tie together, find the common denominator, the common thread that runs through so many destructive agendas, that allows destructive agendas throughout history, really, to see the light of day. And I decided, my thesis is that it's really this fear of being socially rejected that shuts people up, that causes them to even lie about what they believe in order to feel accepted. And that's really what's going on with this whole marriage thing. It's a demonization campaign to shut up and censor anybody who has a different opinion, about marriage.
And I've read your book and it's very, very good. And before we touch on some aspects of that book, I wonder if you can enlighten us a little bit, those of us who might be listening who don't know, what's currently going on in the US around marriage?
It's a little bit complex because a lot of it is tied into what was going on with abortion.
Yeah.
as you may know, the Supreme Court ruled in 1973 in its Roe versus Wade decision, that legalized abortion, that prohibited states really from making many at all restrictions. I mean,
Yep.
they claimed
Yep.
that there was some leeway, but then there was a companion decision that was handed down at the same time called Doe versus Bolton, and that pretty much legalized abortion for all 9 months, if you could say that the mother had a psychological or any kind of issue. But anyway, so then in 1998, Congress, by a vote, the Senate, which is 100 members, by a vote, I believe it was 98-1, or in one absence or something, or 98-2, passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which was meant to state that, marriage would always be recognized as one man, one woman in the United States. 98-2 or 98-1. I'm trying to remember the exact count.
I think it's it's pretty obvious.
In favor of traditional marriage.
Yeah.
Well, state by state in the U.S., there were pushes, started in, I believe, Massachusetts, Vermont had a civil union thing. And then, and all the different states started pushing for this. And then, by 2014, there was this, I guess it was called the Windsor decision, that pretty much abolished the Defense of Marriage Act by the Supreme Court, claiming it was unconstitutional. And then the following year, the Obergefell decision basically legalized same-sex marriage in every state. And so, it's been kind of a long process. And then claiming that, Roe versus Wade was just overturned this year in June by the Dobbs decision. And that's a long story there, with all the mobbing of the justices, conservative justices, and even an assassination attempt on one.
Publishing addresses online, etc.
Yeah, people just gone insane about any restriction on abortion. And now, in certain states now, infanticide is quite legal. Up to, the very day, the due date. So they felt that with this Dobbs decision, or they claim that with the Dobbs decision, they needed an act of Congress to prevent any state from reversing. Just as it had, Roe v. Wade was reversed, they claimed to be fearful that Obergefell would be reversed, allowing states to have, traditional marriage if they wanted. So they had this act of Congress called the so-called Respect for Marriage Act. And that passed by something, I think it was 68 to 30 something, it was, or 67. And they had 12 Republicans sign on to it. So just think about what happened in the course of 25 years. You had the Defense of Marriage Act almost totally unanimous. And then 25 years later, you get 12 Republicans to sign on with every single Democrat in the Senate to agree to this. Anyway, this is a long way.
It's useful. It's useful for people to understand. So they didn't want to wait until the courts did or didn't overturn it. They just thought they would get on with enacting a new act themselves.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because, just as the court, because the court has seeming conservative majority at the moment, because Trump had three, conservative. A lot of people bicker about, whether or not Kavanaugh is all that conservative and so on. But with that majority, seeming majority, they're fearful that Obergefell could be reversed, just as Roe v. Wade was reversed. But it's interesting because they repealed the Defense of Marriage Act. And we're celebrating that the Supreme Court repealed the Defense of Marriage Act. So in the same way, the Supreme Court could repeal the so-called Respect for Marriage Act. So that was just passed. There's all kinds of machinations. It's all kinds of I mean, nobody certainly on the left is consistent. It's all about power, and so anyway, that's just kind of a rundown
That's really, really
chronology
useful.
where we
Really
are.
useful. Thank you. So, in your recent Federalist article, Stella, you said that if marriage can mean anything, it will very quickly become to mean nothing. Can you maybe elaborate on why you said that and what you mean by that?
I believe that so much of what is going on is a push towards our atomization, our isolation as human beings, which again is the subject of my book, The Weaponization of Loneliness. As Hannah Arendt wrote in the mid 20th century in her epic book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, uh, tyrants absolutely need people to be isolated against one another in order to, in order to have power. When there's a very, very strong and vibrant private sphere of life, when you don't have the brokenness of families, you have lots of the norm is families that are cohesive and that move communities forward, put them into action. When you have strong mother-child bonds, where you have strong husband-wife bonds, all of that stuff, all of that is anathema to totalitarians and tyranny. Tyrants absolutely need to isolate people in order to control them. And you can see this just in everyday life. I mean, you can see it on the playground, little tyrannies there. You could see it, the high school, how teenagers, have their cliques and everything. But you can see that kind of action of, social rejection or the threat of isolation in cults also, especially in cults, gangs, mobs, it happens in so many ways, and of course, at the very top level, you've got the world-class dictator like Stalin or Mao or Hitler, who really does try to make sure that people are isolated in order to control them. Now, to get back to your question about marriage, having studied totalitarian systems, I feel that it's clear to me, and I hope it becomes clearer to most people, that the push to, supposedly for same-sex marriage and all of that is really, the trajectory is really towards atomization, because the next play after, they'll do a little thing with polyamory or whatever, polygamy or whatever. But I think the next big play will be to abolish all state recognition of marriage. And what that will do will atomize us further, because if the state doesn't have to respect your marriage, it really doesn't have to respect your biological relationships. And I think that that's where that's headed. There's been lots of literature out there pushing for this sort of thing. Pushing to, instead of have marriage, call it something like everybody gets a domestic partnership if they want. This woman, this feminist legal theorist, her name is Martha Feynman. She wrote a book called The Autonomy Myth back in 2004. And in it, she argues that the state, she's very internationally recognized also. I mean, this is not just some fly-by-night feminist legal theorist, that we should have, instead of state recognized marriage, abolish that entirely and just go to a system of like contract law. Everybody can have their own little domestic partnership, and just have it written up. And of course, the bureaucratic state is sort of in charge of brokering these things. And what this does is it will have a hugely alienating effect. People who think that they are protecting us all from discrimination by promoting same-sex marriage have no idea, a lot of them have no idea where I think this is leading. And it leads to just solitary confinement, really, a virtual solitary confinement, which is what all totalitarian regimes aim for.
And you've also said that marriage and the family stand between the state and the individual. So are you saying that things like same-sex marriage are being used as a way to eventually demolish marriage altogether?
Yeah, I'm not sure how conscious most of them pushing for it are about that. I'm sure that some of those pushing for it, the elites, the power elites, are conscious of it, but I'm not sure how many are. But yes, I think that's definitely where it'll lead. In fact, I don't know how many of your viewers are familiar with a journalist and a lesbian activist, or I don't know, LGBT, whatever,
Yeah.
activist named Masha Gessen.
Right, I know.
And about 10 years ago, she was at a writers' conference in Sydney and made the claim. She came right out and said, let's say, gay marriage is a lie, she announced. Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we're going to do with marriage when we get there. It's a no-brainer that the institution of marriage should not exist. So she came right out and said that, and you know, unapologetically said that, and it was pretty squashed in, you know, in the media. But there's that. There have been a lot of there's quite a paper trail about this intention of abolishing marriage altogether, and I think people need to wake up to that, because you know, it really is a war on all personal relationships and families. It's not just, you know, not just a family, all these mediating institutions, the family, the church. I mean, you know, the real church, not the infiltrated church. The family, faith communities, and real community and real friendship. All of this serves they're called the mediating institutions because they serve as buffers between the mass state and the individual. That sense, a child can actually develop in that kind of environment and develop in a healthy manner. And the other thing I want to say is, because I don't want to forget saying it, and I know it's not directly related to what I was just talking about, but I wrote a piece, I guess it was 15 years ago, when a lot of this was cropping up, about how, you know, I used the title of an old song, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" And you know, the state has no interest. Everybody's talking, like all these senators say, "Oh, who you love." The state shouldn't have a litmus test. That's not the state interest. The state interest should be, you know, the structure of society and stability for children. But the point I made, and one of the points I made in that article, is that, yes, as you said at the beginning, there are many different, you know, there are different constellations of, you know, family. I mean, there's adoption, there's foster families, and so on and so forth. But every human being, my point that I tried to make, to clarify, is that the heterosexual union of one man and one woman is the only means through which any citizen can exist. Period. Period. And I think that we need to understand that our existence is based on that union. Every single individual, whether that individual is what calls himself transgender, or what if they're, you know, medically, quote, intersex, or, you know, any of the, we all, each and everyone, no exceptions whatsoever. Now, I know that there's a lot of medical push to try and change that, you know, artificial wombs and so on and so forth. But that's the one point I think is lost on so many people.
Touched on a few great points there. First of all, the idea that demolishing the family is nothing new, or abolishing the family is nothing new. We've seen it in the Communist Manifesto, which you'll be very familiar with. We've seen it in the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto. We've seen it more recently in the BLM Manifesto, this strange desire to abolish the family. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about that, and also this issue of love is love and born this way, and two things which, when you extrapolate them further, they take us into some very tricky ground around paedophilia, around marriage of children, and all sorts of things like that. Tell us a little bit more about what you've written and spoken about in those areas.
Oh, yeah, no, I wrote a piece about 5 years ago about how pedophilia is becoming normalized at a rate that people weren't quite aware of yet. Now I think we are becoming more aware of it. But, two things will lead to that normalization. And, one of them is the lowering of the age of consent that, they've been pushing for a long time. And the other one is to have pedophilia classified as a sexual orientation. And once it's classified as a sexual orientation, uh, certain laws go into effect that protect all sexual quote orientations. So that's how I see it being done. And you're right. It's all through these mindless slogans. Love is love. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable how fast this train is moving now. But it will take us to a lot of strange places, as you say. Yes.
So I often get criticism that, well, there are so small numbers who get married, same-sex marriage, if you like, that it really shouldn't bother you. You can get on and do what you want, and they can get on and do what they want, and it really shouldn't concern you. So why are you making such a fuss about it? How would you answer that?
Well, first of all, it doesn't end there. It ends with, it continues with artificial reproductive technologies that that exploit women. Oh, they could say, it was her choice to, donate her eggs, or it was her choice to be a gestational surrogate. But, the gestational surrogates are just really criminally exploited in places like, in South Asia. And then, of course, the child has no link with their at least one, in many cases two parents, and doesn't have access to knowledge about their origins. And every child, to uh, develop in a healthy manner, the first transcendental question a child asks is, "Hey, where did I come from?" And and so they want to know, to get that sense of stability, where they came from, that there is a genealogy.
Well, yeah, we've interviewed Katie Faust about these things from Them Before Us, title of her book too. Have you come across Katie?
Oh, Katie Faust.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, yeah. I know
yeah.
Katie.
And I've
Yeah.
spoken to her.
No,
She's very
very
good. And,
compelling.
yeah, very very strong on those
Yeah.
issues.
There's often a lot of exploitation of terminology and stuff. Some people, when they say children's rights, are using it really to promote their own agendas. I mean, that has happened a lot. And in fact, people who are pushing for pedophilia will say, well, child has a right to, their own, sexuality whenever they want, and so on and so forth, without any explanation about undue influence and all the other things that a child has to navigate. Um, but children do have certain rights. They should be allowed to know where they came from, and they deserve to have, when possible. I know it's not always possible, but to know their mother and their father. And there's just no getting around that. I mean, okay, yeah, two people, if they don't want to, have kids or whatever, to whatever, it doesn't, maybe it doesn't affect me. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of things going on that I would object to, but they don't affect me necessarily. But in the long run, they affect society in they can affect society in pretty devastating ways.
So while the social science, Stella, is very very clear that growing up with your married biological mum and dad produces the very best version of the next generation, bar none, nothing comes even close. How do we yet remain sympathetic and kind and gracious when we're talking to people who come from another disposition entirely? And also, do you think the government should more generally stay out of marriage altogether?
No, absolutely. Well, let's put it this way:
Yeah.
the government should recognize marriage. And that means recognizing one man, one woman marriage. As far as other unions are concerned, that of course is the issue that you were asking. How do we come across? It's not unfeeling, but the government absolutely needs to recognize uh, the relationships that create the kaleidoscope of biological kinship.
Mm.
That absolutely must recognize that, or we lose control over all of our relationships.
Mm.
And whether or not same-sex marriage dilutes that, or in the end prohibits the government from recognizing one man, one woman marriage, is really the question that we're dealing with. So, this is a bit, complex. You can't get it into a 10-second soundbite.
I know.
But
that's a very good point. Love is a good short soundbite, whereas the arguments for real marriage take a little bit longer to convey, even though most people believe them wholeheartedly.
Well, there's a reason that for thousands of years, until like 10 minutes ago or whatever, 10 years ago, for thousands of years, every culture, for every surviving culture, has recognized that this is the fount of our humanity. This is how we come about, including the gay person, including the transgender person, including the intersex person. It doesn't matter. Every single human being comes about through that relationship, no matter whether it happens in a petri dish or naturally or artificially or whatever. And that's what they have to answer to. And that their existence is due to that relationship. It's due to that bond, and everybody's existence. And so that's really the fundamental point. And unfeeling, well, I know it sounds pretty awful. I mean, there's a title that puts off a lot of people called, I think Ben Shapiro wrote the book, Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings. I know there's certain things that maybe we all would like, we all want, maybe desperately want in life. But I don't know how to, you can just be a nice person and say things gently.
Yeah.
That doesn't change the facts.
It doesn't change the facts, the wider sociological facts. You're quite right.
Yeah, but that is the road, that is the trajectory. How does it affect me? This is a trajectory it puts us all on, including them. I mean, you basically invite the government into your bedroom. Quite the contrary. They were always arguing in the past that, get the government out of our bedroom. But if the government no longer recognizes marriage, it won't be long before it no longer has to recognize any of your biological relationships. I mean, already that's happening in the language. The 117th Congress passed their rules last year, stating that they would no longer, and the rules recognize the terms mother, father, everything was desexed. It was, instead of sister or brother, you had to say sibling. Instead of mother or father, you had to say parent. Instead of son or daughter, you had to say child. I mean, it's getting to the point, it's getting, ridiculous, but they've changed the language in official documents, and it's, that affects me.
Well, not only that, but I live in a part of the UK called Wales, and we have a separate administration here who are in charge of education, and they've decided that they want to be able to teach children, very young children, that you can be born in the wrong body, and they've removed the parental right to withdraw their child from that teaching. So the government knows better what to teach your children than you do. And for many people in Wales, we feel they've crossed a fundamental line in doing that.
Yeah. So that's right. And so you can't tell me this doesn't affect me. You've already got the state doing, interfering with my relationship with my child.
Yep.
And this is a very predictable outcome. It should be a predictable outcome. of where all of this stuff is leading, and it leads again to our atomization.
Yep.
And when you say, when going back to your question about how do you come across without sounding insensitive or unfeeling and all of that, well, the whole point of what I call the weaponization of loneliness,
Yeah.
the machinery of loneliness that's used by tyrants has been used very effectively by this agenda, by this so-called marriage equality, which is really anti-marriage agenda. And basically the main components of the machinery is political correctness, identity politics, and mob agitation to enforce self-censorship, to silence us, so that we're fearful of being called bigot, hater. They come up with all these terms to smear anyone who has even an innocent question. They smear you as, I mean, today they keep pushing all of these terms, including things like, I'm sure because I'm making these connections, I'd be called another favorite, my favorite of them, conspiracy theorists.
Yeah.
Okay, that's another smear that's used.
Yeah.
And even now they got like election denier is another smear for somebody who has a concern about elections. So it goes on and on and on and on and on. The demonization campaign is central to pushing all of these agendas, and we have to just wake up and see that the demonization and it happens time and time again, especially for people of goodwill. I don't know if you're familiar with a book that an activist, a radical activist, wrote back in the early 70s, I think it was, Saul Alinsky.
Oh yes, Rules for Radicals.
Yes,
yes,
radicals.
Yeah, it's almost like a guidebook these days. It's like,
exactly.
oh, I recognize that. Yeah. I've seen that. Yeah.
And one of his prime rules to push through these kinds of agendas is to use the goodwill of the middle class or those you're dealing with against them.
Yeah.
And that's what a demonization campaign does. It silences because we're afraid of being smeared. I mean, who's the insensitive one here? I mean, it's almost like their love is love slogan is sounding more and more to me like a variation of the Orwellian, freedom is slavery, and so on. And then love is hate. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from a lot of these folks now with these agendas.
Yeah. I suppose the thing is, who defines what hate is? When you're in a culture where words are deemed violence and violence is deemed justifiable in order to defend against words, well, that's a funny old switch we find ourselves in.
Right. Well, I know this is very hard to unpack, and I try to unpack it, but that's really where you end up is all of this stuff is a war on private conversation, personal conversations, private life, family life. It's all a war on relationships. And I just don't see it any other way now. That's where, let's see the trajectory. The trajectory is alienating us more and more. And censorship is, of course, absolutely central to that. And so they induce censorship. We do a lot of the heavy lifting for tyrants when we self-censor because, then we do a lot of their work for them. And then they can do the top-down censorship in free societies. They could call it misinformation governance board or whatever. And then they can just really, push it forward.
That's why your work is so powerful, Stella, because you pick up on the individual's tendency to self-silence, whereas in fact, nobody can be cancelled unless they're complicit in that cancelling. We all have, by default, the right to free speech.
Yeah. Well, here's another point I like to bring up that I think is related to that is there is so much brokenness now in the West, especially, family brokenness that has been pushed by, so many different kinds of agendas, including like the welfare state and, trying to increase dependence on the mass state versus your, nest of family and hearth and home,
Yep.
where you don't need the mass state. They there's been a lot of, I hate to call it success, but there has been success with a lot of these so-called progressives who have been attacking in so many different ways human bonds, good, healthy human bonds. You see the divorce rate and out of wedlock rate of children, and the abortion becoming like legalized infanticide now, and the torturing of kids, at their most formative years, preschool, very young, where they're told, you could be in the wrong body, and they're at that age. I don't know how many of your viewers are familiar with the work of Jean Piaget, that famous
very much so.
psychologist. Children have to work out. They have to navigate the line between reality and imagination, and it can be terrifying for them to as they're working that all out. And then you get these school systems that mess around with their minds that way, not allowing them to develop naturally, and just kind of leading them into all these crazy mazes of who am I? And it's so destructive. It's so destabilizing for a young, innocent mind. And it's just really, when you get down to it, I mean, it's just criminal.
So asking a former CIA analyst then, what's the way out? How do we get from where we are to where we need to be? Maybe we can't go back, but how do we defend the culture? How do we see the culture revive and thrive based on real marriage?
Well, there's a lot of work to be done, obviously. We've kind of reached kind of a tipping point, it seems. So, we can't expect overnight success, but here's what I would say about that. First of all, we need to recognize this is an asymmetric war. We're not going to get out of it by depending on any of the corrupted institutions. It's not going to happen in education or media. It's going to happen in this private sphere of life, in the hidden sphere. I cite Václav Havel's essay numerous times in my book, The Power of the Powerless. And he was a Czech dissident in Soviet Czechoslovakia, and then later became, after the Berlin Wall fell, he became the president of the Czech Republic. But he was a playwright and a dissident author. I know they don't like to be called dissidents, but he wrote this really powerful essay called The Power of the Powerless. And it was about how the hidden sphere of life is really where all the power is. These relationships. I mean, imagine millions of people having billions of freely spoken conversations. Tyrants can't do much at all about that. So he talks about how maybe your viewers are familiar, or your listeners are familiar with this parable of the greengrocer, and how the greengrocer decided suddenly he was going to take down the Workers of the World Unite banner that was in every shop. Everybody had to have it, but if it did, and nobody paid attention to it. But once it was gone, well, then he would, he could end up being canceled, and he would be, but he'd pay a price, but he would be showing others the truth. He would be illuminating the truth. Well, anyway, that's a famous parable of his. But the major point is that it is in this private sphere of life where our power is. And we have to protect and defend it, and reach out to to know who your neighbor is. If there are really true community volunteer associations, local, that's where it all starts. And then it ripples outward from there. That was his thesis. And it's true. When people are able to overcome that fear of saying what they believe, it does have a ripple effect. Because the people who implicitly trust you but may not know what you believe,
Mm.
If you have a gentle conversation and express an opinion that is politically incorrect, you may be surprised
Mm.
at how
Mm.
they know. Bahama brings that up in his Power of the Powerless. We don't know in this
Mm.
kind of suppression of speech what other people really think.
Mm.
They might agree with you, and you've emboldened a like-minded thinker, and that has
Yep.
a powerful ripple effect. The second thing that can happen, there are three things that can happen. The second thing is you could be engaging a fence sitter, and then you've had an influence. The third thing that can happen why everybody wants to shut up is because they might be talking to someone who disagrees with them and gets
Yep.
mad. But you've done something at least as valuable by watering down the stereotype associated with your point of view if you're talking to somebody who implicitly trusts you. Now, I'm talking about one-on-one kind of conversations. And my favorite book on propaganda, Jacques Ellul's classic, Propaganda, The
Mm.
Formation of Men's Attitude, has one very pithy statement in there. And that's that propaganda ends where simple dialogue begins.
Mm.
And we have to shed our fear of having those real conversations. And it's probably everybody has a different threshold. And there is so much brokenness in
Mm.
society with
Mm.
families and communities that it really kind of falls upon those who have strong, uh, you know, ties, family life to fall back on, for support,
Yep.
to get out there and lead the way.
Yep.
And that really will, I believe that really creates a ripple effect, because free speech is use it or lose it, as
Yep.
I often say.
Well, you've said in the past, when you can't speak freely about what you believe, you end up polluting public opinion. And that's absolutely right. So we've got many examples of that in the UK, where people are not willing to speak their mind, and therefore you can't trust public opinion. Even our lawmakers. I often refer to a Comres piece of research back in October 2018, an anonymous survey of our MPs, members of parliament, which found that over half of those who responded felt that they were not at liberty to speak their mind on certain LGBT issues. So this is our lawmakers don't feel free to speak up on what they really believe, and one would guess therefore don't feel free to vote with their hearts. So you're right, it seems we can't wait for the institutions or our lawmakers to use a progressive phrase, we're the people we've been waiting for.
And the other thing about free speech that people don't really grasp is that without free speech, we can't have relationships.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you can't speak openly to anybody,
Yeah.
what kind of relationships can you have?
Yeah.
I mean, we become
Yeah.
atomized, we
Yeah.
become isolated,
Yeah.
and living in our own little cubicles of solitary confinement as, we're, quote, alone together.
Yeah, and that brings us back to marriage, because permanence means you can be yourself. It means you can say anything. It means, for example, who is it said, each man is like the moon, he has a dark side that nobody ever sees. Well, when you're married, your wife sees that dark side and you see her dark side. But because it's permanent, you have to learn to live with it. You have to learn to live together. And that's something you don't get in cohabitation. Cohabitation is essentially where somebody says, well, you'll do for now, you're the best I can find. But if that changes, or if you annoy me too much, then it's over. And that must be a terrible way to live. But marriage, of course, allows the freedom to grow and live together, knowing that, you really made this decision for life.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I would encourage everyone to take a look at your book, Stella. It's a great book, especially chapter 10, which talks about marriage and the family and the church, etc., and what's going on in terms of government attempts to silence and atomize from that perspective. And maybe we'll have you back sometime if you're willing to talk about chapter 10, because you do deal with matters very comprehensively and profoundly in the book. But meanwhile, can I just say what an absolute privilege it's been to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time, Stella Morabito. It's a privilege to talk to you.
And it's a privilege to talk to you, Tony. Thank you very much.